Brookhaven wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. The small suburban town was the sort of place where people still left their doors unlocked, waved to strangers, and borrowed sugar from their neighbors without a second thought. On September 8, 2002, the morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves. The streets were still damp from an overnight drizzle, glistening faintly in the thin dawn light. Inside a modest brick home on Elm Street, 24-year-old Sarah Caldwell sat on her bed, pulling on her black and gray running shoes. She moved with quiet confidence. She'd been a runner since high school, and lately she'd been training for the Brookhaven 10K. Helen Caldwell, her mother, leaned against the doorway, coffee mug in hand. "You're up early again," she said, her voice warm but with the faintest trace of concern. Sarah smiled without looking up. "Trying to beat my time for the race. Besides, I like it before the streets wake up. Feels peaceful." She stood, zipped her bright red windbreaker, a gift from her father, and tied her long brown hair into a ponytail. The red jacket would later be burned into the memories of everyone in town. "Back in 30, Mom," she called, grabbing her water bottle and stepping out into the cool air. As she jogged down Elm Street, neighbors caught glimpses of her. Mrs. Denon, walking her beagle, remembered Sarah's wave and smile. Luke Peterson, another early jogger, saw her cross the old wooden bridge near the park, earbuds in, hair swinging with each stride. Sarah's running route was simple: start at Elm, cut through Brookhaven Park, loop the nature trail, and back home. She'd done it hundreds of times without incident. But somewhere along that 3-mile loop, something happened. By 6:50 a.m., Helen glanced at the clock and frowned. By 7:15, she was calling Sarah's phone, straight to voicemail. When she set out to walk the trail herself, Helen's pace quickened with every step. She passed the bridge, scanned the path, and then saw it, Sarah's left running shoe, lying in the mud just past the trailhead. It was still warm to the touch, still damp with sweat, but there were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to explain why it was there. Helen's knees buckled as a cold certainty gripped her. Sarah wasn't coming home. If you ask any investigator, they'll tell you. The first 2 days are everything. After that, your chances of finding someone alive drop fast. Brookhaven police mobilized quickly. The trail where Sarah was last seen became a command center. Officers marked the area with yellow tape, the soft hum of radios breaking the eerie morning silence. Search teams spread out in grids. Scent tracking dogs picked up Sarah's trail from the shoe, but it ended abruptly at the roadside. It was as if she'd stepped into a car. Detective Paul Norris, the lead investigator, would later say, "This wasn't someone wandering off. This was fast, deliberate, and planned." Witnesses started to come forward. A newspaper delivery man swore he saw a black SUV idling near the park at 6:40 a.m. The driver was a man in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap. Another jogger reported seeing a red jacket vanish behind a cluster of trees, but assumed it was just someone changing course. By noon, the search expanded to nearby fields and waterways. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the ground. Volunteers in orange vests combed the grass with flashlights, even in daylight. That night, Helen's phone rang. She answered, heart racing. There was no voice on the other end, only slow, heavy breathing. Then a click. The call came again the next night, and the night after that, always from a different payphone, always just breathing. By the second day, the FBI was called in, but with no ransom demand, no body, and no confirmed sighting after 6:45 a.m., the trail was already growing cold. And somewhere in that still, quiet town, someone knew exactly what happened to Sarah. Detective Marlowe sat alone in the dimly lit police viewing room, the hum of the monitor the only sound in the otherwise silent space. Hours of reviewing city surveillance footage had already blurred together: pedestrians, streetlights, the occasional stray cat darting across an alley. But then, at 11:47 p.m., a flicker caught her eye. On the grainy black and white feed from a camera 2 blocks from the bus station, Erin appeared, her long auburn hair visible even in the poor lighting. She was walking briskly, clutching her tote bag close to her side. She seemed tense, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Marlowe's brow furrowed. Something about her body language screamed fear. The camera panned just enough to reveal someone else. At first, it was just a faint blur in the corner of the frame, tall, hooded, keeping a deliberate distance. As the seconds passed, the figure adjusted pace to match Aaron's. Not running, not rushing, just stalking. The detective leaned forward, pausing the video. Zooming in only distorted the pixels, but the outline of the stranger was undeniable, broad-shouldered, face obscured. Even in poor quality, the intent in the posture was chilling. She rewound, watching again. The moment Aaron turned her head sharply to glance back, the hooded figure stepped briefly into the glow of a lamppost. Just enough light to catch a strange glint near the face, like metal. A piercing? A tooth filling catching the light. Marlowe made a note to check the department's database for known offenders with facial piercings. But then, something stranger happened. As Aaron approached the intersection, a black sedan rolled up from a side street. The driver didn't honk or flash headlights, just slowed down beside her. Aaron froze, clearly startled. The hooded man quickened his steps, but before Marlowe could fully process the sequence, the footage skipped forward, 2 full seconds lost. When the video resumed, Aaron was gone. The black sedan was gone. And the hooded figure? Standing dead still in the middle of the sidewalk, staring directly at the camera. It wasn't the kind of accidental glance people make when walking past a security camera. This was deliberate, unblinking, almost as if the man knew someone would be watching later. Marlowe felt the hairs on her arms rise. She replayed the moment several times, noting the slight tilt of the head, the faint, unnerving smirk. Whoever this was, they weren't afraid, they were confident. Almost taunting. She pushed back from the monitor and dialed the station tech team. I need frame-by-frame analysis on camera number 14, 11:47 to 11:50 p.m., she instructed. And check for any interference. Someone might have tampered with the feed. While she waited, Marlowe looked again at the case notes. The bus station camera hadn't captured Aaron boarding any bus. The station clerk claimed she'd left on foot. So, who was in the black sedan? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Officer Carter, holding a manila folder. Detective, you might want to see this, he said, sliding the folder onto the desk. Inside was a still frame, captured from an entirely different street camera the same night. The hooded man again. Same clothes, same stance. Only this time, he wasn't alone. In the blurry image, Aaron was sitting in the passenger seat of the black sedan, staring straight ahead, her hands rigid in her lap. And the driver? His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but his left hand on the steering wheel bore a distinctive tattoo, a black serpent coiled around a dagger. Marlowe's stomach sank. She'd seen that tattoo before, in case files marked violent offender, missing persons, and organized crime. Whoever took Aaron wasn't just some random stranger. This was bigger, much bigger. The rain had turned into a cold, relentless drizzle by the time Harper locked up the shop that evening. The sky was an oppressive shade of gray, and Main Street felt quieter than usual. She wrapped her scarf tighter and started toward her car, parked under a flickering street lamp. That's when she noticed him, an older man leaning against the corner of the old post office, his jacket collar turned up and a battered baseball cap shadowing his eyes. At first, Harper thought nothing of it. Towns like Ridgeway always had someone loitering, waiting for a ride, or just watching the world pass by. But as she passed him, she felt it, a shift in the air, the subtle prickling of the skin at the back of her neck. The man's gaze followed her. Miss Harper. His voice was gravelly, but low, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. She stopped mid-step. Do I know you? She asked, keeping her tone cautious. He stepped forward, and in that moment, she saw his face under the lamplight, tired eyes, deep lines etched into his weather-worn skin. No, he said simply. But I know you. Or at least, I know about you. You're asking questions about Emily Summers. Harper's breath caught. Very few people knew she had been digging into Emily's disappearance. Not yet. How do you know that? She demanded. The man glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street. His voice dropped to a whisper. You need to stop. Whatever you think you're doing, it's going to get you hurt. People here, they don't like the past being dug up. She studied him, unsure whether to feel threatened or grateful. Why? Do you know something? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Let's just say I was here when it happened. And I saw things I shouldn't have. But I'm not the only one. The people involved, they're still around. And they'll do anything to keep it quiet. Harper's journalistic instincts flared. Then tell me, who are they? But before he could answer, The sound of tires crunching over wet gravel drew both their attention. A dark SUV turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the mist. The man's face paled. "I can't talk here," he said quickly, backing away. "Meet me at the edge of Blackwood Forest. Tomorrow, near the old ranger station, right after sunset. Come alone." "Wait." Harper started after him, but the SUV slowed as it passed, and by the time she looked back, the man was gone, disappearing down an alley. She stood there, heart pounding, rain dripping from her hair. The stranger's warning echoed in her mind, but so did his fear. Whatever happened to Emily Summers, someone in Ridgeway wanted it buried. And now, Harper was sure, she was getting close. 2 weeks after the strange encounter with Mr. Thompson, Claire's life settled into an uneasy rhythm. The sun still rose over Cedar Falls, kids still played in the park, and coffee still brewed at the local diner every morning. But Claire felt like she was moving through a shadow of the world she once knew. Every step she took, every corner she turned, was wrapped in a quiet tension she couldn't name. She had been staying at her friend Marissa's place ever since the police reopened Daniel's case. Her own home felt like a stage where a crime had been committed, a place soaked in memories and unspoken warnings. Marissa had been nothing but kind, but Claire could tell her friend was getting nervous too. Sometimes, she'd find Marissa glancing out the window, her eyes scanning the street as if expecting someone to be there. It was late one Thursday night when it happened. Claire was alone in Marissa's living room, curled up on the couch with an old blanket and the TV flickering softly. Marissa had gone upstairs to sleep, leaving Claire with the quiet hum of the house. She wasn't paying much attention to the TV. Her mind was still tangled in thoughts of Daniel when the cable signal flickered. The picture warped for a second, the sound cutting out into bursts of static. At first, she assumed it was just the weather or a bad connection. But then, through the crackle, a voice came. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make her freeze. "Claire." Her heart stopped. She turned the volume down slightly, her eyes wide, straining to hear. The voice came again, distorted, but unmistakable. "Claire, it's me." She felt the blood drain from her face. It was Daniel. She knew his voice as well as her own heartbeat. Every inflection, every soft edge, it was him. But how? She reached for the remote, flipping through channels, trying to find the source, but no matter where she turned, the static followed. It was as though the voice was not coming from the television at all, but from somewhere inside it. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The static roared louder, then softened, and through the haze, she heard him again. "They're watching. Don't trust." The signal cut abruptly. Silence. Just the hum of the TV and the pounding of her own heartbeat. She sat frozen, her breath shaking, staring at the screen. Her first thought was to call the police. But how could she explain this without sounding insane? And if she was hearing things, what did that mean about her own mind? Marissa's footsteps creaked on the stairs, breaking the moment. "Claire? Why are you still up?" Claire turned slowly, her voice weak. "Did you hear that?" Marissa frowned, glancing at the TV. "Hear what?" Claire's lips parted to speak, but she stopped herself. She couldn't explain it. Not yet. Instead, she muttered, "Nothing. Must have been the signal." But deep down, she knew it wasn't nothing. Daniel's voice had found her, through static and shadow, and it wasn't an accident. And if he could reach her this way, maybe he wasn't gone after all. The week after Marissa's disappearance was a blur of panic, sleepless nights, and unanswered questions. The small town of Willow Creek had never seen such a case before. Missing persons here were usually found within hours, often safe. But this time, the hours turned into days, and the days felt like years for those who loved her. Detective Harris doubled down on the investigation. Every lead, no matter how small, was followed. CCTV footage from nearby gas stations and traffic lights was analyzed frame by frame. They spotted Marissa's car heading west on County Road 14 shortly after she left her mother's house that evening. But there was no sign of her on the footage from the next camera, just empty road. Somewhere in the few miles between those points, she had vanished. The media swarmed into town, their camera crews lining the streets, interviewing neighbors, and pressing the family for statements. Rumors began circulating. Some claimed she had been abducted, others whispered about possible deaths or a secret lover. These baseless theories only added to the family's anguish. Her mother, Lydia, refused to believe any of it. My daughter wouldn't just disappear, she told a local news reporter, her voice trembling but firm. Someone took her, and I won't stop until she's home. Her words struck a chord with the community. Volunteers poured in for search parties, combing through the wooded trails, abandoned barns, and even drainage ditches. But as days passed, hope began to fade. The case began attracting online attention from amateur sleuths who dissected every detail, posting theories on forums and social media. Some thought the answer lay in her last known location, the stretch of rural road surrounded by dense forest and a few scattered farmhouses. Others suspected someone she knew might have been involved. Detective Harris found himself facing increasing pressure. The town wanted answers, the media wanted a story, and the family wanted their daughter back. But every time they thought they had a lead, it collapsed. Witness accounts that didn't match up, sightings that turned out to be false, and phone tips that led nowhere. One rainy afternoon, Harris visited Lydia again, hoping she might recall some overlooked detail. As they spoke, Lydia suddenly remembered something. A voicemail Marissa had left earlier that day, before she vanished. Her voice had been hurried, almost anxious. "Mom, I think I saw something strange on my way over. I'll tell you about it when I get there." That message changed everything. It wasn't just a disappearance. It might have started with something Marissa witnessed. Something dangerous. And if that was the case, the person responsible might still be watching. The case had just shifted from a missing person search to a race against time. Detective Ramirez sat in his car, parked across from the small cafe on the edge of town. The place was almost empty, just a few locals and an older man in the corner, hunched over a cup of coffee. The man's weathered face and nervous glances told Ramirez everything before a word was spoken. He had something to say, but he was terrified to say it. The man's name was Harold Briggs, a retired railroad worker who had lived in Hollow Creek all his life. When Ramirez slid into the booth opposite him, Harold's hands trembled as he fidgeted with his spoon. "I ain't supposed to be here," he muttered. "I seen something the night Emily disappeared, and I was told to keep my mouth shut." Ramirez leaned forward, keeping his voice calm. "Harold, if you saw something, it could be the key to finding out what really happened to her." Harold swallowed hard. "I was walking my dog, round 11 that night. I passed by the old Wexler barn. You know, the one folks say is haunted. There was a truck parked there, lights off. And I swear I saw a woman in the passenger seat, and it looked like Emily. She was arguing with a man. I didn't see his face, but his voice cracked. She didn't look safe." Ramirez's pen froze over his notepad. This was the first credible sighting of Emily after she left her home. But Harold wasn't finished. He leaned in, whispering like the walls could hear him. "I didn't tell anyone 'cause 2 days later, someone left a dead crow on my porch. No note, just the bird." The cafe's door creaked open, and Harold's eyes darted to the entrance. A tall man in a dark coat walked in, glanced around, and then left without ordering. Harold's hands shook more violently now. "You see? They're watching. They know." Ramirez knew this was dangerous ground. Whoever had left that crow wasn't just warning Harold. They were warning anyone who dared to speak. And if Emily had been at that barn, the question now wasn't just who took her, but who was powerful enough to silence an entire town. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cafe's old windows. Somewhere deep inside, Ramirez felt it. The clock was ticking, and the truth was closer than ever. But so was the danger. The storm outside was reaching its peak, rattling the old cabin's wooden frame like a warning. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper through the cracks, carrying with it the tension that filled the room. Lily's flashlight beams swept across the dusty floorboards, her mind still reeling from the message they had found hidden inside the worn envelope. The truth lies where the floor creaks the loudest. Mark knelt near the center of the living room, tapping each board with the handle of his flashlight. Thud, thud, hollow. They both froze. "That's it," Mark muttered. The sound had a deeper, emptier echo, like something was hidden beneath. Lily's heart thumped hard. She knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the grooves of the aged wood. The boards were uneven, their edges splintered from years of neglect. Mark pulled a small multi-tool from his pocket. He had kept it with him since the day they first arrived, never expecting it to become their key to unraveling the mystery. With slow, deliberate pressure, he began prying up the plank. It gave way with a reluctant creak, sending a puff of stale, musty air into their faces. Lily coughed, waving the dust aside, her eyes straining to see into the dark cavity below. Mark reached down and pulled out a small, metal tin, the kind you'd expect to hold biscuits, but far heavier. The faded label on the lid was unreadable, worn away by time. When Mark unlatched it, the hinges squealed. Inside were dozens of yellowed photographs, each one of a little girl, dark hair, bright eyes, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Lily's breath caught. "That's her," she whispered. Mark nodded grimly. It was the same girl from the newspaper clipping they had seen earlier, the one listed as missing over 2 decades ago. But these pictures were different. They weren't just snapshots from before her disappearance. Some showed her holding a birthday cake with more candles than she should have had at the time of her alleged death. Some showed her standing in front of buildings that looked recent, not from the year she went missing. "That's impossible," Mark said under his breath. "She couldn't have been alive years after they said she was gone." Lily's hands trembled as she sifted through the photographs. At the bottom of the stack was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a rush. "If you're reading this, it means they didn't find me in time. She's not who you think she is. Don't trust the man who wears the ring." Before Lily could process the cryptic warning, a sudden loud knock echoed from the front door. Both of them jumped, their eyes locking. They weren't expecting anyone. Mark quickly slid the tin back under the floorboard and replaced the plank, his hands moving faster now. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. Whoever it was, they weren't planning to leave without an answer. Lily took a step toward the door, her breath shallow. But when she reached for the handle, a voice drifted through the wood, low, deliberate, almost taunting. "You found something that doesn't belong to you." Her hand froze on the knob. The storm outside suddenly seemed quieter than the pounding of her own heartbeat. And in that moment, Lily knew, whatever they had just uncovered wasn't just a clue. It was the reason someone might be willing to kill. The morning of February 12, 2018, dawned like any other, cold, gray, and unremarkable. But by noon, everything had changed. Detective Harris sat at her desk, scrolling through yet another backlog of case files, when a notification popped up on her computer. Possible DNA match. Her pulse quickened. The message was from the state crime lab. For weeks, she had been chasing dead ends, revisiting old evidence, and fielding calls from a grieving mother who refused to give up hope. Harris clicked open the file, her eyes scanning the words quickly. Partial DNA match found in Cody's database. Match linked to case file hashtag 84-12. Unidentified remains recovered near Willow Creek, 2002. Willow Creek was nearly 200 miles away. Back then, the skeletal remains had been labeled unknown female, aged 20 to 25. No connection had been made to Emily's case because of the incomplete DNA technology at the time. But now, thanks to advancements in forensic science, a partial profile from a hair found in Emily's old sweater had been matched to those remains. Harris called the lab immediately. "How strong is the match?" she demanded. 78% likelihood, the technician replied. Not enough for a positive ID, but strong enough to warrant further testing. By that afternoon, Harris was driving toward Willow Creek with a renewed sense of purpose. She stopped at the rural sheriff's office, where a dusty cardboard box labeled Willow Jane Doe, 2002, sat on a shelf, untouched for years. Inside were photos of a shallow grave, fragments of clothing, and a small silver locket, engraved with the initials ES. Her breath caught. Emily Summers. But the discovery raised even more questions. If these were Emily's remains, who buried her there? And how had they gotten so far from her hometown? Most importantly, why was there evidence suggesting she might not have died in 1996 at all? This was the first real lead in over 2 decades, and Harris knew she was about to rip open a case that had been buried, both literally and figuratively, for far too long. Detective Laura had been staring at the envelope for hours. It had arrived at the station without a return address, slipped through the mail slot late one evening. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. It read, "You're looking in the wrong place. Emily was never meant to be found." The choice of words immediately sent chills down her spine. This wasn't a random taunt. It felt personal, almost as if the sender knew Emily. But it wasn't just the message that caught Laura's attention. It was the way the letters were formed. The uneven loops on the Y, the sharp downward slashes on the T, and the faint smudge of blue ink where a hand had paused too long. Laura compared it to a stack of old notes from the original investigation. When she laid one next to another, her breath caught. The handwriting matched a statement taken from Emily's former neighbor, Gerald Thomas, a man who had moved out of town right after her disappearance. At the time, Gerald had been ruled out because he had an alibi, but that alibi had never been fully verified. She called Mark immediately, her voice low and urgent. "You need to see this. We might have just been handed our missing piece." The next morning, they drove 3 hours to track Gerald down. He was older now, thinner, with eyes that darted nervously when Laura placed the envelope on his kitchen table. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. "That's what we're here to find out," Mark said, leaning forward. "Because unless there's someone else who writes exactly like you, Gerald, we think you know more about Emily Summers than you've been willing to admit." Gerald swallowed hard, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I told myself I'd take it to the grave." But before he could finish, there was a loud knock at the door, and everything changed. Detective Harris had been inside many homes during his career, but the Thompson farmhouse felt different. The walls seemed to breathe with memories, and the air was thick with the kind of silence that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He had gone upstairs to recheck the bedrooms, but something about the narrow hallway leading to the attic caught his attention. The door was small and nearly hidden behind an old wooden coat rack. He tried the knob. It didn't budge. "Do you have the key to this?" Harris asked Mrs. Thompson, who stood at the base of the stairs, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. "That attic hasn't been opened in years," she said, too quickly. Harris knew that tone. People only said things like that when they didn't want you to look. He stepped back and examined the frame. The lock was rusted, but the edges of the door were cleaner than the rest of the wood, as if it had been opened recently. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see inside." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, then slowly disappeared into her bedroom. Moments later, she returned with a small brass key. When Harris turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The smell hit him first: dust, old fabric, and something faintly metallic. At the top, the beam from his flashlight landed on a row of old wooden trunks. But what froze him in place wasn't the trunks. It was the wall. Every inch of it was covered in photographs of Ella and Ellie, hundreds of them, from baby pictures to school portraits. Some were torn. Others had scribbled notes on the back. And in the center was a photo of the twins taken just days before they vanished. Beneath it, taped to the wall, was a single word written in thick black marker: "Mine." Harris swallowed hard. Whatever happened to the twins, it had started here. The warehouse felt colder that night, though the air was still. The hum of the city seemed to fade into the distance as Detective Harris and Mia stood in front of a rusted metal door at the far end of the building. It was the last part of the property they hadn't searched. Harris's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off a small plaque on the door that read, "Maintenance. Authorized personnel only." But there was nothing maintenance about the heavy lock hanging from the latch. Mia swallowed hard, her heart racing. "This has to be it," she whispered. The detective didn't respond. He just knelt, producing a lock cutter from his bag. With one hard squeeze, the metal snapped, echoing in the empty space like a gunshot. Inside, the room was small, almost claustrophobic. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic hung in the air. In the center, a table stood with a single wooden box on top, the kind that looked hand-carved decades ago. Harris carefully flipped the lid open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of the missing people from all the cases they had been chasing. But in every picture, a shadowy figure stood in the background, barely visible. Mia's breath caught. It's the same person in every one. There was also a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Harris turned to the first page. The handwriting was messy but deliberate. "They never see me coming. They never know I'm there. But I've been watching all along." The deeper he flipped into the pages, the more disturbing the entries became, each one describing the final days of the victims in chilling detail. And then, on the last page, a single line stood out. "The next one will be someone who's already looking for me." Mia felt a wave of dread wash over her. "Detective, this means..." Harris's face was pale. "It means he knows about us. And he's not done yet." Somewhere in the shadows of the warehouse, a faint creak echoed, like footsteps retreating into the darkness. The hunter was already here. Detective Alvarez stood in his small office, staring at the wall covered in photographs, notes, and strings connecting one clue to another. For weeks, the puzzle had mocked him. Too many missing pieces, too many contradictions. But now, the pattern was beginning to emerge. The photograph of the old farmhouse, the bank statement showing large, unexplained deposits, the anonymous tip about a deal gone wrong. They weren't isolated events. They were part of a larger, calculated plan. As he traced the red string from one photo to another, his pulse quickened. It was all right there, hiding in plain sight. The person everyone had trusted the most had been orchestrating the entire deception. Meanwhile, Marissa sat in her living room, holding the torn page from the missing journal. Her hands trembled as she realized the handwriting matched someone she had seen every day for years. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an outsider. It was someone within their circle. And now, the truth was no longer a mystery. It was a ticking time bomb. Detectives brought Daniel Morris back into the interrogation room, this time armed with hard evidence. The man who had long maintained his innocence, who had publicly painted himself as a friend of the Winters family, was now facing a stack of documents and photographs that threatened to unravel his entire story. On the table lay the most damning piece, a time-stamped security video from a gas station just 5 miles from the lake where Sophia's body was found. The footage showed Daniel at 2:14 a.m., the exact time he claimed he had been home asleep, buying gasoline and bottled water. When confronted, Daniel's confident demeanor cracked. His hand trembled as he reached for the paper cup of coffee in front of him, his eyes darting toward the camera, recording every second of his reaction. I was just out for a drive," he stammered, but the detectives weren't buying it. They pressed harder. Why buy gasoline in the middle of the night? Why was his truck spotted later near the lake road? And why did a witness, a fisherman, claim he saw someone matching Daniel's description throwing something heavy into the water the very night Sophia vanished? The room was silent for a long stretch as Daniel stared at the floor. It was as if the weight of the truth was pushing down on him, but he still wasn't ready to admit anything. Detective Harris leaned forward, voice low but sharp. "Daniel, we know you weren't just a friend. We know about the texts. We know about the argument that night." For the first time, Daniel's eyes flickered with fear, not anger, not defiance, but pure fear. The shattered alibi was only the beginning. What came next would expose motives no one had imagined. The old railway bridge loomed above them, its steel frame creaking softly in the midnight wind. Flashlights flickered across the dark water, beams catching glimmers of debris beneath the surface. It was the very spot where, according to old police logs, one final piece of evidence had been discarded nearly 2 decades earlier. Detective Marlowe's voice was low but sharp. "Drop the sonar here. Sweep the full grid." The divers obeyed, their equipment humming as it sliced through the water. Emmanuel stood at the edge, heart pounding. He had spent years searching for answers, years being told the case was hopeless. But tonight felt different, like the truth itself was clawing its way to the surface. Minutes turned into an hour before a distorted image appeared on the sonar screen, an object wedged between rocks, partly buried in silt. The divers descended again, vanishing into the cold blackness. When they resurfaced, their faces were pale. One held up a small, rusted metal lockbox. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were dozens of photographs, every single one featuring Sarah in different places, different clothes, some from days before her disappearance, and some from months after the world believed she was dead. The final photo made Emmanuel's hands tremble. Sarah, holding a newspaper dated 3 years after her death, standing in front of a house deep in the Canadian wilderness. The last page inside the box was a handwritten note in Sarah's familiar looping script. "If you found this, then you've come far enough. But if you truly want the truth, look where the river meets the pines." Emmanuel looked up, eyes locking with Detective Marlowe. No one spoke, but they all knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. As the river roared beneath the bridge, the camera would fade to black, leaving the audience with one question burned into their minds. Was Sarah still alive, or had someone else been leaving the trail?